thank you so much. So next, I'm very happy to introduce Arianna Sforzini, who is maîtresse de conférences en philosophie at the Université Paris-Est Créteil. She is previously a postdoctoral researcher in aesthetics at the University of Fribourg, and has also taught philosophy at the Sciences Po, and is a member of the Association pour le Centre Michel Foucault. She has been associated researcher to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and also a postgraduate fellow at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. She's the author of 2 monographs, as well as many essays on Foucault's thought and contemporary continental philosophy, particularly in its relation to the arts and the performances of bodies. She will speak today on a paper entitled New Archives, New Genealogies. Is the Foucauldian Enlightenment still relevant today? Please welcome her.
Thank you very much. Before I start, let me thank Nikki for her invitation. Wonderful welcoming and organization. And thank you all the people who are making this event possible. And it's my turn to apologize for my English, which is a sort of Italo-Franglish. So if I'm not clear, you can ask me for clarifications after the speech. So the Foucault archives deposited at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in 2013 with some 110 boxes of manuscripts and unpublished documents has not ceased since to nourish new editorial projects and multiple research paths. In recent years, it has contributed to a major renewal in the way philosophy is done on, with, and after Foucault. So drawing on a number of texts from these archives, I would like to address a question that is vertical to Foucauldian thought, that of its inclusion in the legacy of the Enlightenment, which the archives allow to trouble with another genealogy, that of Foucauldian Nietzscheanism and an aesthetic of light, as an experience of a blinding, unbearable, tragic truth, the truth of Nietzsche's Dionysus, Dionysus, I think in English, but it's difficult, of Manet's paintings, of scenic Parisia. So can we slide from an aesthetic of light to the aesthetics of radical enlightenment? Or better, as this slide is obviously methodologically questionable, I will just use it as a critical tool. Can we bring Foucault's fundamental relationship to light into play to better understand his attitude towards enlightenment and the construction of a philosophy of the present? Judith has perfectly put the present into question. I won't focus on that concept in my speech. My intervention will actually reflect on the importance of the notion of modernity in Foucault's analysis to help rethink the present modernity in which we live, maybe, and think 40 years after his death. So Foucault's relationship with the Enlightenment is complex and hotly debated. This is not the place to delve in detail into this historiographical and political debate, which has already been evoked by Frédéric Rose and Judith Revel. So not made of purpose. There is a Foucauldian convergence on this theme, which is probably interesting in itself. The importance in Foucault's thought of the 2 texts, What is Enlightenment, the American and the French version, both published in 1984, cannot be underestimated. Through a critical commentary on Kant's 1784 article, Was ist Aufklärung, Foucault sketches out a conception of the Enlightenment as a philosophical attitude rather than a historical period. The Enlightenment embodies both the capacity and courage to think for oneself, renouncing all intellectual tutelage and fully assuming responsibility for one's own private public intellectual positioning. Foucault calls modernity that quite specific relationship to the present, borrowing the concept from Baudelaire. modernity is in fact not only a chronological frame, it is again a political and ethical dimension. The subtle and relentless work of understanding both what makes our actuality what it is, what builds us as the subjects we are and perform in our actions and thoughts, and at the same time, what enables us to transform our present, to imagine that we can be other than what we are. As Foucault stated in a famous quote from the American version of Was It Enlightenment, Baudelairean modernity is an exercise in which extreme attention to what is real is confronted with the practice of a liberty that simultaneously respects this reality and violates it. Kant, Baudelaire, but also no doubt Machiavelli and Nietzsche. In this expression, even if somewhat disturbing for our contemporary sensibility, of a freedom that at once respects the reality and violates it, is in French rapes it, le viole, Foucault recognizes, we don't know how consciously, with one of the first thinkers who inaugurated the rupture of modernity as a paradigm of thought, renouncing a preconceived and transcendent normative framework for intellectual work, particularly on historical and political reality. That is Niccolò Machiavelli. In chapter 25 of The Prince, Machiavelli describes the man of virtue precisely as that modern hero who has the courage and intelligence to seize fortune and bend it to his desires and wishes. Fortune being a woman, she loves those who are bold and know how to bitter bump her, who know how to be violent with her and use her to assert themselves and ride a wave of contingency in their own present. And Nietzsche takes up this idea 300 more or less years later in several of his texts and fragments, saying, for example, it's the excerpt of the part 3 of the Genealogy of Morality. Wisdom is a woman and can only love a man of war, carefree, mocking, violent. So this is not the place to open this debate, but it's obvious that we should question the radically masculine and macho dimension of this vision of the man of virtue in our modernity, which Foucault implicitly repeats by asserting that freedom is fundamentally a relationship of transfiguration of present reality that respects and violates it. Which places that to women's heroism and virtue in seizing upon their present, it's an open and tricky debate. And I leave that aside. But Western modernity, so from the break with the dream of a universal empire and the ethical teleological framework of the Middle Ages to Nietzsche's radical questioning of the universal value of truth, seems capable of being defined in an essential courage, carefree, mocking, and even violent, to use the words of Nietzsche, capable of appropriating the present as a framework for existence and thought, and turning it into a form of life that is a perpetual exercise in self and word criticism. In this sense, Foucault does not appear to be postmodern at all, but rather hypermodern. In his ceaseless work of questioning the forms of our discourse and practices. So why Foucault has also been made the herald of the counter-modernity, of the anti-enlightenment. As Frederick Groh mentioned this morning, Foucauldian thought that there are intellectual and political strategies specific to our times that attack Foucauldian thought as one of the essential references of the woke particularisms. And it's easy enough to show that Foucault, as we have done in the discussion, though fiercely anti-universalist, is hardly irrationalist. This label is a distortion coming from a misunderstanding of Foucauldian reopening of Nietzschean perspectivism. The power of reason as a critical force is not afraid of its own history, and certainly does not need to remain fixed within the framework of universalism. Foucault does not pose himself outside reason, but instead he has always worked for historical questioning of the forms of reason. Truth, reason, nature, and man are subject to the freedom to think, and the critical thought, or better philosophy for Foucault, designates above all this privilege of freedom. So the archives deposited at the BNF help, in my vision, to support this thesis that Foucault was the heir to a Nietzschean enlightenment in his desire of making his relation to his own modernity as an attitude of critical freedom. I'll take just one example from the fragments of the unpublished second volume of the History of Sexuality in his first draft, that is to say, La chair et le corps, the flesh and the body. These fragments show that the study of early modern Christianity, the age of reforms, is an essential moment in Foucault's production. Through a long detour through the moral teleology of the 16th century, and in particular the history of confession of the sins of lust, Foucault makes the period of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation the great age of the subject. It's a Foucauldian expression. So subjectivity emerges as a problem, and I quote, "The problem of the subject as an element in a relationship of authority, as the pole of a relationship of knowledge, and as an individual who must both wait and work out his salvation." Foucault's approach is not a quick, a simple reworking of the topos of modernity as the birthplace of the individual, the first person of religious, political, and scientific revolutions. On the contrary, Foucauldian analysis about concupiscent modern Christian flesh sketch out a counter-history of the subject of modernity, which, rather than revealing its intimate truth, problematizes its primary evidence. It is a subtle critique of modern myths of the subject. The subjectivity at stake in the religious struggle around reform is not the absolute subject of modern philosophy and science, the Cartesian foundation of true rational knowledge. Rather, Foucault opens up the field of analysis that is subjectivity as a field of struggle and governmental network, the interweaving of relationships to self, to others, and to truth, both imposed and freely claimed, which will be at the heart of his later analysis about the ancient world. Through the history of confession, the modern subject emerges as the place where the unstable search for self-truth, the confession, always engaged and never completed, must be perpetually made and remade. It is the open risk of the temptation and the possession of evil, and the historical and contingent product of a plurality of political bodies and power relations that operate on and from it, as the violent 16th and 17th century wars for religion and political salvation reveal. Foucault isn't then an anti-rationalist philosopher who destroys the legacy of modernity. He constructs several genealogies, as the genealogy of flesh and confession in the early modern age, in the age of reforms, that are parodies of modernity in the Nietzschean sense of the term. The identification of historically differentiated phases of modernity that can disrupt common visions and the conventions of thought. Genealogical history, as he asserts in an unpublished manuscript, shows, I quote, how far we are from that which founds us, which establishes us, even if that which founds us is closest to us. End quotation. So reason, subject, and truth are not denounced as illusions, but shown in their relational, plural, and agonistic dimensions through the history of the religious practices of confession and direction of conscience. Foucault remains a philosopher of the Enlightenment, it has been said, but in this Nietzschean sense of a determination to challenge through history the ironic face of self-evident truth, of a reason without conflict, and of a universalism as a presupposition and not as a contingent and fragile construction. So in the last part of my intervention, I will see I have the time. I would like to conclude this discussion on Foucault, philosopher of the Enlightenment, by doubling it through the evocation of a dimension that is not only metaphorical, but a true reality in his analysis, that of light itself. Foucault never ceased to reiterate his law of the sun, of warmth, of light. In his 1955 lecture at the École Normale Supérieure, La question anthropologique, the anthropological question, the final part is of Nietzsche, and the final lessons establish a compelling equivalence between Dionysus and the sun as an experience of bright, cruel light, where our reassuring illusions dissipate to reveal the tragic truth of the world. What he learns from Nietzsche is that the essence of truth, its deepest mark, is not, as the classical philosopher keeps saying, that it illuminates and shines like a light that we must follow to make our way through the fog of illusion and the night of mistake. The real difference is not between light truth and night error, but between the light that guides and indicates reassuring truths and the light that dazzles, hearts the eyes, and makes us experience a blinding and unbearable truth, the tragic truth of the world as chaos. Foucault stated in an unpublished early fragment on Nietzsche, more or less contemporary to these 1955 lectures, that he would like to follow in his analysis, quote, the poem of the adventures of this light of the world, that a bloody incompatibility links to man's light on himself, to the light of the clear gaze. A year after his 1955 lecture on the history of the anthropological question in 1956, while immersed in the long Swedish night, Foucault returns to this essential theoretical and personal relationship with light, and writing a letter to a friend, it's almost a cry, I have a Nietzschean need for sun. 10 years later, his choice of Tunisia, where for the first time he was offered a position as a philosophy professor, is again a choice of the sun, but also of the sea. As he wrote to his companion Daniel Defer in November 1966, I want to have an immediate, absolute relationship with the sea without civilization. End of quotation. In Tunis in 1966, 1968, Foucault gives, among others, a lecture on the place of man in modern Western thought, providing a sort of genealogy of modern philosophical thought. And the lectures on Manet, considered the first painter of modernity, who through his raw, radical relationship with light, chiaroscuro, colors, and the materiality of the canvas, performed in the realm of painting the same gesture that Nietzsche carried out in the realm of thought, and Mallarmé in the realm of literary language. It is to say, a questioning, again, of the modern subject of thought and its representative relationship to reality, to propose new forms of anti and counter-representative thought, of which artistic practices are an important element of critique and materialization. By distancing himself from the French university and its Eurocentric models, as we had told, as Lynn has explained us this morning, and by undergoing decisive political experiences in Tunisia in the same years, is May 1968, Foucault also takes distance from himself, being able to take a critical look at the history of Western philosophical modernity, and in particular at this man of humanism who had become its locus of truth. This truth sought and worked on by Foucault is thus part of this light that does not illuminate and clarify, but blinds. We can also see in Foucault's Californian experience in May 1965, in his experimentation with LSD in the Death Valley, as recounted by Simeon Wade, a sort of intellectual and existential test of this radical enlightenment, to use the expression of Jonathan Israel, a vibration of the light so strong that it causes the forms of the world to tremble and almost dissolve. The dazzling Californian desert enabled Foucault for the first time to experience a culture of the self as self-transformation. It is the experience of a pleasure as Spinozian joy, not a pleasure taken from the relationship with oneself, but the opening up of the self to the disruptive and scandalous pleasures of plural relational bodies. So Foucauldian philosophy contains then, in my view, not only an aesthetics of existence, but also an aesthetics of light, a raw, cruel light, the blinding light of Oedipus and Nietzsche, but also the light that allows to have that relationship of both understanding and transfiguration of reality that Foucault underlines in his reading of the Enlightenment and modernity. The dazzling light of Foucauldian analysis is the scandalous light of the materiality of Manet's paintings, the light that Baudelaire finds in Constantin Guy, painter of modern life, light as the public testing of the truth of the ancient cynics, described in Foucault's last lecture at the Collège de France. And that will be my last remark. The cynic philosophical movement, led by figures such as Diogenes, Crates, or Hipparchia, perhaps the first great woman philosopher, did not unite around founding theoretical statements, but around a singular, particular way of life. They led a very frustrated existence, using their destitution, their poverty, their wandering, their life exposed to the light of day, as an instrument of provocation to denounce social conventions. And at the same time, they also turn their rough-hewn discourse into a powerful critique of generalized hypocrisy and social farce. The harsh exposure of one's own body and word of truth to the unfiltered light of reality makes cynics true philosophers, because it's always for them a question of truth, freedom, and rationality of existence, without having to refer to a universal framework of truth and the transcendent rationality. For the cynics, since they call themselves philosophers, it was a question of producing, of manifesting truths, but above all, not through knowledge or demonstration, by the exhibition of the body in its elementary sexuality, the affirmation of unmediated pleasure, the harness of its relationship with the elements, wind, sun, rain, etc. To describe this cynical way of life, Foucault immediately returns to the vocabulary of light and of public spectacle to say basically, when the philosopher makes only discourse the element of manifestation of even the most scandalous or paradoxical truths, nobody minds. But when he makes his body in an open performance in the light of public space, the point of exhibition of truth, this truth immediately becomes unbearable. And as Diogenes famously said to Alexander the Great, stand out of my light. get out of my sunlight. The translation are multiple. And I think it's this opening and exposure of the self to the unmediated light of unfiltered truth that makes this truth not a series of normative statements, but a technique of the self and a form of life. It is then no doubt through Diogenes' sunlight that we can slide from the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the courage to criticize the obvious in the search for truth, to a Foucauldian aesthetics of radical light as an aesthetics of existence. Foucault does not advocate for the refusal of truth, of reason, of modernity, but for the courage to expose oneself to the dazzling light of truth as a task still open to our modernity. In this attachment to the courage of truth and freedom, Foucault is probably far more modern than his postmodern readers have wanted to see. And it's up to us to decide whether this modernity is still ours. Thank you very much.